Today we finish our study of Ruth, and if you've missed any of the 8 messages, I encourage you to use the sermon module on our website or our YouTube channel or the sermon audio app, or ask for the manuscripts, or somehow catch up on any parts that you've missed. Not because my teaching has been great. Go read somebody else if you want to do it that way. Go read Sinclair Ferguson's little book on it. If you want a commentary on it, Ian Duguid's commentary, Duguid, is fantastically warm and practical and gospel-centered. In one way or another, just make sure you have wrapped the book together, and it's a story that you have really gotten into your heart and you can take with you, because it is a story that glorifies your Redeemer, magnifies Jesus, points you to the goodness of God and his faithful love for you and his purposes. But then it's a story to tell. And I had incorporated this into my sermon and cut it for time, so maybe we'll talk about it at Grace Groups. But this is a story that is so relevant, so modern. It's just ripe for telling to other people to point them to Jesus. Plus, it's a beautiful, powerful mentoring tool, because it teaches what a woman of God looks like, what a man of God looks like. It teaches what you ought to look for in a spouse. It teaches a girl how to ask a guy to marry her. I mean, it's very practical. So you'll want to make sure you know it well. We have already studied Naomi and Boaz, and we've been putting together a list of themes about Ruth. So you see it there: Ruth's darkness, her kind and generous love, her determined loyalty, her commitment, her hard work, her surprise, her refuge, her request. And today we add the last two: Ruth's gifts and Ruth's heritage. And you see that I just put a 4 after each of those, chapter 4. The chapter doesn't divide into those as if they're 2 points. They're both sprinkled throughout the chapter. So we'll talk about them along the way this morning. So we're going to follow kind of a different structure that you see on your handout, beginning with redemption completed. Let's pause and pray one more time, though. Father, if we're going to stand on every promise of your word, we're going to have to hear it. If we're going to be changed by the word of Christ, we're going to have to hear it. And no earthly preacher can take words on a page and change lives, bring people to repentance, create sanctification, cause the new birth, convict of sin, bring hope, renew life. No preacher can do that. A preacher is a channel, a weak, impoverished channel. You're the provider of all the things that need to happen this morning for your glory. So would you take a weak preacher and weak hearers and demonstrate your strength? I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Redemption completed. Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. So this is the next day after Ruth had come to him and asked him to marry her so that he would be redeemer for Naomi's family. So he went to the gate and sat down. The city gate was the place of law and business in these small towns, the place where the elders gathered to lead the town. So verse 1 continues, "Behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, 'Turn aside, friend, sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down." So if you remember, in Bethlehem, there was one other relative of Naomi's deceased husband, and that one other relative was actually a closer relative than Boaz. So the potential redemption was presented to him first. So verse 2, Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." So it's hard to know exactly what was going on there, but it's obvious that first of all, the family's name was going to disappear. That was already evident because there was no grandson. But also the family's property was about to disappear. So this family in Israel was going to be gone, both in name and in inheritance. Verse 4, so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Okay, so we're going to pause there. There are a lot of things there we've already talked about. What I'm seeking to point out today is Ruth's gifts. In other words, the things Ruth gave. So we have two of them here in verse 5. He says, the day you buy the field, you acquire Ruth as your wife in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So, first of all, you have buying the field. If a redeemer bought the field from the hand of Naomi, he was buying it to keep it in the family. Remember my illustration earlier about somebody in your family going to an antique store and selling away an heirloom, and then somebody else in the family goes and buys it? Okay, so it's buying it so that it stays in the family. Boaz bought it, but why did he buy it? Because Ruth asked him to. So in a sense, it's Ruth's gift, okay? Her first gift to the family is the family property. The family property they kept really because of Ruth. And then the second gift is what we read there at the end of verse 5. In order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. That means that the family name wasn't going to die out. The name of her deceased husband would continue. So Ruth's first gift was the family property. Her second gift was the family name. Now let's keep reading. Verse 6. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So then it's up to Boaz, right? Skip to verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Those were the two boys, right? The sons who had died. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. So do you see the gifts there again? You have in verse 9 the gift of the family property, and then you have again the reference to the name of the dead. So that's the family name. But then there's a third gift here in verse 10, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. Okay, so what does that mean to not have your name cut off from the gate? Well, it means, to use the famous American phrase, no taxation without representation. It means that the town leaders who made the town decisions in these small towns met at the gate, and whoever the dad was in the family went and represented the family. So what happens if dad dies? Well, then the sons go and represent the family. What happens if the sons die? Well, then the grandsons go. What happens if there are no grandsons? You have no representation. Your family has no voice. You have no more influence in what goes on in that town. So the third gift that Ruth gave was the family's voice in the town. When Boaz married into the family as a redeemer, he could then legally represent the family, and especially the son that he and Ruth had could represent the family. So the family kept its property, kept its name, kept its voice in the town, all because of Ruth. Those were all gifts that she gave. And those gifts, in a sense, they were completed when Boaz and Ruth got married, but actually those things partly depended on them having a son. So it's really verse 13 where redemption is completed. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So at that point, unless that boy died as a child or something, the property, the name, the voice of the family are fairly well assured. Redemption was completed. Okay, so do you start to see that picture of all the things that God used Ruth to give that family that were about to be lost? Next, we have Bethlehem's blessings. We'll come back to Ruth's gifts later, just kind of pointing out things as we go through the chapter. So next, we have Bethlehem's blessings. When redemption was completed, the people of Bethlehem spoke their blessings. You can think of them like prayers that they spoke kind of publicly for Boaz and Ruth. And this is such a sweet part of the story. Do you remember that when Naomi came back to Bethlehem, the whole town was buzzing with excitement? And then what did Naomi do? Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. God's lashed out his hand at me and taken everything away. Okay. Threw some cold water on that party. But then, as they saw what God did, they ended up with the whole town celebrating and blessing the new marriage and then the baby. So first of all, the first blessing happens at the gate when it's legally completed. Boaz is going to take Ruth as his wife. Verses 11 and 12. Then all the people who were at the gate, so there's a crowd that's gathered for this, right? All the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily." That's our mighty word that we talked about. "May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So this is, I love this picture of the townspeople gathered, of the crowd, of the elders together, and they are just joyously speaking this blessing for Ruth, for Boaz, and for Boaz's house. So first of all is the blessing in verse 11 for Ruth. And the blessing is, the prayer is that she might be like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the house of Israel. They certainly knew how to hope big. Rachel and Leah, those are the mothers of like the 12 tribes of Israel. Like they are the matriarchs of this family. So we're just going to pray that Ruth will be like them. Build up the whole house of Israel? Are you kidding? She was a poor Moabite whose Jewish husband might have been taken by the Lord in judgment. Yet the leaders of Bethlehem prayed that she might have a great heritage. That's our other word, right? Ruth's gifts and Ruth's heritage. That she might have a great heritage building up the house of Israel like Rachel and Leah. That was a crazy thing to pray. And yet somehow they sensed that God was up to something big. God wasn't limited by Ruth's disgrace or Ruth's poverty or Ruth's ethnicity. You're not going to stop God with any of that. She would build up the house of Israel. She would build up the house of God among all nations through her. The second blessing in verse 11 is for Boaz. May you act worthily. That means continue to be a mighty man in the best ways. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. Ephrathah is kind of an important word because in this chapter, as we'll see later, part of the point is that you have the whole tribe of Judah, but you have the line from which Jesus will come narrowing down. In other words, you have a clan, and then you have another clan. So you have the reference to Perez, that's a clan. You have a reference to Ephrathah. That, again, seems to probably be a reference to a clan in Judah. So basically it's saying, may Boaz continue to be a mighty man and prosper and have renown in his family in Israel. Did that happen? Boaz is renowned. Here we are 3,000 years later talking about him. Yes. And then the third blessing in verse 12 was for Boaz's house. So that means his family and his heritage. And so verse 12, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So we're going to come back to Perez later, but basically both, okay, so you remember that Boaz and Naomi are related, right? Boaz and Elimelech are related. They're both from Judah's son Perez. Judah had lots of sons. They're both from Perez. So that's the clan that lives in Bethlehem and that all this is happening among. So Perez ended up having a significant family, and the prayer is that Boaz would have a significant family, a heritage like that also. Did he? Did Boaz end up having a significant family? Just the King David family. Yeah. So these things, this is one of those times in the Bible when somebody prayed something and God's answer turned out to be far greater than they could have ever fathomed in what he did. Okay, so that's Bethlehem's first blessing. It's the elders and the townspeople. They are having a party at the gate, celebrating and praying about what God may do. Now, the second blessing comes later when the baby's born. And so this blessing is from the women of Bethlehem when they learn that Naomi had a grandson, the same women whom Naomi lashed out at when they tried to celebrate before. Ruth 4, verse 14. Then the women said to Naomi, see, she bore a son, the end of verse 13. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Boy, that is quite a thing, they said. So they began with a blessing for God. Blessed be the Lord, which means may God be praised. Why? He has not left you without a redeemer. Naomi thought God had left her without a redeemer. Naomi thought all hope was gone. Naomi thought God had turned against her. And they say, look, let God be praised because he hadn't forsaken you. So may God be praised for giving you a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. It would be nice if they were talking about God. Hopefully they meant that too, because they said, may God be praised. But who are they talking about? You see it? End of verse 14. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. Who are they talking about? It's the baby, right? They're talking about the grandson, who was technically the redeemer in the ultimate sense. So the second blessing is that the grandson's name would be renowned in Israel, that Ruth would have a great heritage, and Naomi would have a great heritage through her. And then verse 15, look at this line. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. All right, so the reference to being a nourisher of her in her old age means that Naomi would have somebody to care for her, right? The only person she had to care for her was Ruth, when Ruth was wonderful, but Ruth had very little resources to help care for her with. Now God was providing a way for her to be cared for in her old age. But look at that phrase, he shall be to you a restorer of life. Well, wait a second. Naomi wasn't dead. She wasn't even close to dying. So it's obviously a metaphor, right? And so various translations render it, he will restore your youth, he will encourage you, he will renew your life. When we met Naomi back in chapter 1, she was not an old woman. She was a middle-aged woman who had plenty of life in her physically, but in non-physical ways, her life had nearly been squeezed out of her. She was physically alive, but in her spirit, she was withering away, discouraged, confused, bitter, hurting, lashing out, doubting, hopeless. So you know what this is, right? You've seen it in somebody you love. They're alive, but they're like walking dead. There's just no will to live left. There is no hope left. That's where Naomi was. And through Ruth's sacrificial love for her, God restored her life. He renewed her purpose. He renewed her hope. So we've been listing Ruth's gifts. This was a marvelous gift that God gave to Naomi through Ruth. Ruth gave Naomi her life back. God gave Naomi, through Ruth, her life back. And then the end of verse 15 speaks of another gift, and that's the gift that Ruth herself was. Ruth was a gift, and it's stated in a stunning way. Your daughter-in-law, this is the end of verse 15, your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. Now, in 2019, it would not be unusual to say that a female is more valuable than 7 males. That would be a normal thing to say today. In that culture, the way that was structured, at least legally, 1 son was better than 7 daughters. Not in God's sight, that's not what I mean. But the way culture worked, 1 son was much better than 7 daughters. So how priceless was Ruth to Naomi? What the women of Bethlehem say is, your daughter-in-law is worth more to you than 7 sons. That was a crazy thing to say. Like, you couldn't give a girl a higher compliment than that. And why was Ruth so priceless? If you're a Bible marker, just go crazy with this phrase in verse 15, because it's one of the keys to the whole book. Your daughter-in-law who loves you. The book of Ruth is a love story about Ruth's love for Naomi. It's right there. Your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. She was so priceless and so precious because of her faithful, sacrificial, hardworking love that would not leave her mother-in-law, even when she was a bitter person who was no fun to be around, even when she commanded Ruth to go back to Moab, even when faithfulness to her mother-in-law meant working in the fields all day long, every day, Ruth was not going to go. And she was priceless as a gift. So how many of Ruth's gifts have we listed or referred to now? The family property, the family name, the family voice, a future for Israel. God gave Israel a future through her. A wife for Boaz. God gave to Boaz. A grandbaby for Naomi. There's Ruth herself, the gift she was to Naomi. Restored life for Naomi. She was quite a giver, wasn't she? Those are Bethlehem's blessings. Now, we come next to Naomi's privilege. And actually, what we find here again is another one of Ruth's gifts. Ruth 4, verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first of all, it doesn't have to mean that she literally nursed the baby. That's actually unlikely. It means that she had a very special relationship with the child, like my grandparents on my mom's side had with me. I was the baby in my family, so my mom had me in her early 40s. So she was a full-time teacher and going to grad school when I came along. So my grandparents played a big role in helping raise me in those first years of my life because my mom was a busy lady. Though my mom did her best, she would bring the crib into the classroom. You could do things like this back then. She would bring me into the classroom in the crib sometimes. But my grandparents on my mom's side, played a very important role. So Naomi is getting to play that kind of role with this baby. But scholars guess that this goes even further than that. Beyond just a grandparent who gets to spend a lot of time with a grandson, We know already that Naomi had a legal relationship with this grandson. He was her only heir. And so some scholars think that Ruth actually gave the son to Naomi in a very special way. Maybe a little bit like Hannah with Samuel in the temple. Maybe something a little bit like that, so that Naomi actually raised him as her own son. Kind of like a, foster mother or something. It's hard to know that for certain, but I think no matter what we can see from verse 16 is that Ruth did everything she could do to give that baby to Naomi, that she might have every joy and every privilege of the grandson, the Redeemer, whom God had provided. It was as if this grandson was her very own son. Remember, she lost both her sons. And now it's as if God through Ruth, gave her another one, whom she got to raise. So add that to the list of Ruth's gifts. She gave to Naomi the privilege of being like a mother to this boy. Now we come to the conclusion of the book in verses 17 through 22, and these genealogical references that show how important this little story is in God's big story. And I'm calling this the Lion of the clan of Perez. But I'll explain that in a few minutes. First of all, verse 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave the baby a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. That might mean like servant or something, maybe related to how he would serve Naomi. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, you already know that. You've already read that. We've already been there. It's not a surprise for you. But you know what it's like to be reading a story or watching a movie in which the author suddenly ties everything together in a way that you didn't see coming. And you are both startled and delighted, and you're like, no way! That's this moment. For a Jew who didn't know, if they read this story and got to 17b, they would have gone, no way! You are kidding. They would have loved the story up to that point. But when they saw what it meant, it would have been mind-blowing. They would have seen that God had been working in this little broken, messed up, hurting Jewish family to bring King David to Israel. But the surprise isn't just for a Jew reading it. It's also for the Christian, because you know that Jesus came from David. And so when the Christian reads the story, you come to verse 17 and you read, he was the father of Jesse, the father of David, the father of great-grandfather of Jesus, and you go, no way! You realize that God was working in one hopeless family situation 3,000 years ago to give you a redeemer. And then, just like with a good book, once you see how it all ties together, you go back and read it again. And then you see all the things you missed along the way. Then you go back to Ruth chapter 1 and you read through the story again and you see Jesus, 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 Jesus all over the story. So in the end, Ruth's heritage included David and then Jesus. And of course, Ruth is named in Matthew chapter 1 to connect her right to Jesus. We could also say then that David was one of Ruth's gifts and Jesus was one of Ruth's gifts. How's your list now? Isn't that wild? So we'll come back to that at the end. Ruth's heritage included David and Jesus. Ruth's gifts. All right, so now we got to keep going though, because the book isn't over yet, right? Verse 18. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Huh? Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. So the story ends with a genealogy that connects Perez to David. It isn't a complete genealogy. We know from other overlapping genealogies that this skips. There are at least 2 places where this skips several generations. The point isn't to give a complete genealogy. The point is to show the connection from Perez to Ruth, Naomi, to David. Remember that Perez was the son of Judah, from whom Elimelech and Boaz descended. He was the ancestor of their clan, and from that clan came King David. David was a Perizzite, we could say, which is not the same thing as a parasite. But you know what else that means? If David came from Perez, that also means that Jesus' physical mother Mary came from Perez. And it also means that Jesus' legal father Joseph came from Perez. Both Joseph and Mary come from Perez. That's what the New Testament tells us. So, when God went to work to provide the great King David who would bring glory to Israel, he did it through a troubled, compromised family that had abandoned Israel for Moab in the family of Perez. When he went to work to bring Jesus, he did it through that same family. And so it all ties together to lead us to Jesus. And so there are just so many things in the story that connect to that. Like, if you go back to the Bethlehem blessings, by the way, isn't the Bethlehem connection just downright fascinating in itself? There was a greater blessing coming to Bethlehem someday. But if you go back to the Bethlehem blessings and those things they said about may you have renown, may you have a family, may you have a future, a heritage, that's not just David. That's the people of God through Jesus. That's you. You're part of that family. It's the family of those born again through Jesus that were part of the renown and the heritage that God was going to bring through that family. All right, so hopefully that makes sense so far. The end of the book connects Judah's son Perez with David, and you have Ruth and Boaz in the middle, and then that connects David to Jesus. So you've got Judah, Perez, Boaz, Elimelech, Ruth, David, Jesus. Right? Now, that still doesn't answer the big question. Why Perez? Because you could have picked any of those generations along the way, right? Like, why do we say Jesus is from Perez or David is from Perez instead of from one of these other people? Like, why not start with Ram? Why not start with Aminadab? Why not just start with Judah? That's what we normally do. You're normally known by, the sons of Israel were known by which one of those sons they descended from. Judah or Benjamin or Simeon or Levi or whatever. Why is Perez important? And he really is important because verse 18, these are the generations of Perez. Why his? And back in verse 12, may your house be like the house of Perez. So there's something weird going on here. There's some strange emphasis on Perez, and here's what's even stranger. We don't really know anything about Perez. Like his character, the works of his life, the things God did through Perez. Don't know. Okay, so what's the deal? Well, the answer is that it's not actually about Perez. He's important, but only in a legal sense as the heir of Judah. Kind of like Obed. How much do we know about Obed? You know, his life, his character? Nothing. Obed's important in a legal sense, but God knew you didn't need to know his story. What's really important about Obed is his mom. And what's really important about Perez is his mom. And you see that in chapter 4, verse 12, because she's named in a kind of unusual way where you wouldn't expect her to be named. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So it's not actually Perez you need to know about, it's Perez's mom, Tamar. Just like Obed is legally important, but it's really Ruth you need to know about. All right? So Tamar is why Perez is emphasized in the story. Because Tamar and Ruth are a crazy parallel. Now, they're a contrast too, thankfully. But Tamar and Ruth are a crazy parallel, and the residents of Bethlehem knew it. That's why they talk about Perez in verse 12. They watched what was going on with Ruth and Boaz, and they were like, whoa, this sounds a lot like Perez and Tamar and Judah. They couldn't believe the connections. And so that's why they referred to it and why the genealogy ends that way. Okay, but I still haven't told you what the connection is. How did Tamar and Ruth connect? Every preacher can't wait to get to this story and figure out how to talk about it in church. Okay? So here we go. And this is so complicated. And I apologize for being complicated, but I have worked as hard as I can possibly work to try to make it as simple as I know. So this is the best this poor preacher can do. First of all, there's more than one Tamar in the Old Testament. There's another tragic Tamar, this daughter of David who is awfully abused in 2 Samuel 13. That's not this Tamar, okay? We're talking about a Tamar way back in Genesis 38. So here's her story, and it's not a story that can be read in a setting like this one, but I'm going to try to summarize it for you. So we start with Judah. Judah was one of the sons of Israel, from which the 12 tribes came. So, I say sons of Israel, I'm talking about Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, 12 tribes, 12 sons, kind of, right? Follow me so far? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah was one of those sons, and Judah, okay, those families were given land, right? Their own territories. That's why we keep talking about your land. Judah left his land to go hang out with the Canaanites. Does that sound like something that happened in the book of Ruth? Her father-in-law left the land to go with the Moabites. Okay, Judah left his land to go hang out with the Canaanites. Judah found a Canaanite girl he liked, and he married her. And he had sons with her. Those sons grew up and needed to get married. Apparently, Judah was still hanging out with the Canaanites, and so he found a Canaanite wife for one of his sons. Okay, admittedly, the Bible doesn't exactly say that. Okay, it doesn't say Tamar was a Canaanite, but everything in the story suggests that was the case. It would be highly unusual that she was a Jew based on the story. Okay, so scholars are almost certain that Tamar was a Canaanite. So, just like Elimelech came to Moab and his boys married Moabite girls, Judah came to Canaan. He married a Canaanite woman, had sons who married Canaanite women. How are we doing so far? Okay. So one of that Canaanite woman who married one of his sons, who had the name so and Tamar, that wife was Tamar. Okay, so Tamar is the daughter-in-law of Judah. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, half Canaanite son, who marries a Canaanite woman, Tamar. Okay? Was an evil guy, and God took his life. Does that sound like something that happened in the book of Ruth? Well, we don't know for sure. We don't know if Ruth's husband died because of God's judgment, but the story kind of hints at it. It's possible. Regardless, Tamar's husband died because of God's judgment, and so now she was a widow, just like Ruth's husband died, and Ruth became a young widow. So what was supposed to happen next? Well, as we learned with the story of Ruth, one of Er's brothers was supposed to marry Tamar and have a son who would be the legal heir of That's complicated, but we've talked about it before, right? And it's also weird, but it's what they did. weird to us in our modern culture today. Okay? So one of those brothers was supposed to marry her. So one of those brothers was supposed to, and basically he refused to. And so God took his life. Now, I don't know whether she had actually married him or not, but now she's doubly a widow. So her father-in-law, Judah, says, don't worry, I've got another son. You just got to wait for him to grow up, and you can marry him. And so she waits. Well, here's the thing. Judah was watching his boys drop like flies. And he thought, aha, Tamar's the problem. No more of my boys are marrying her. So he told her, you can marry this other son, but he was lying. He had no intention of letting any more of his boys have anything to do with Tamar, even though Tamar wasn't the problem. So in the end, Tamar tricked her father-in-law into having a physical relationship with her, and it worked. She and her father-in-law, Judah, had a son who became the heir. That son was Perez. Got it? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. Get out of the way. Tamar and Judah have a son, Perez, from whom comes David and Jesus. This is one of those sermon manuscripts you might want to request a copy of if you want to go back through all that. So there is this crazy web of comparisons between Ruth and Tamar. But in the end, Tamar's son Perez was the ancestor of Elimelech, Boaz, David, and Jesus. So what's the point? Well, I don't know for sure, but I've suggested the point with the heading on your handout, the Lion of the clan of Perez. Who is that lion? What does Revelation 5:5 call Jesus? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's true, he is. And he's called that because Jacob referred to Judah as a lion. So when we think of the strength of Judah and the strength of Jesus, and thanks to C.S. Lewis, the whole generations have thought of that more clearly, we think of Jesus as this conquering lion. That is true. And then Ruth says, can we fill in that story just a little bit more? Do you know which son of Judah Jesus descended from? It was Perez, the son born through circumstances so sordid that pastors can't quite read them in a normal Sunday morning service. The son born through Judah's love for the Canaanites and Judah's wrongdoing and Judah's evil sons judged by God. The son born through a Canaanite woman who prostituted herself with her father-in-law. Jesus is from that clan within the tribe of Judah. He is the lion of the clan of Perez. The guy that, humanly speaking, nobody would want to talk about. It would be a family secret you stuck in the closet. In Jesus' family tree, you have Tamar, the Canaanite, a story of disobedience and judgment and so forth. In Jesus' family tree, you have Ruth, the Moabite, who, though not doing wrong herself in this story, was at the mercy of a Jewish family that did a lot of wrong and turned away from God. And actually, in the book of Ruth, you have a hint of Rahab. She's not named, but it's possible that in verse 20, Rahab's Jewish husband is named. So, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Canaanite, Moabite. What kind of people do you have in your family tree? These are the people Jesus has in his. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, a mighty lion. But Judah was a worldly, compromising, immoral, unethical mess. And Jesus is also from the clan of Perez, the one born from immorality, and from Tamar the Canaanite, and from Rahab the Canaanite, and Elimelech the worldly, and Naomi the bitter, and David the adulterous murderer, and on you go. And Jesus is not ashamed to call them his ancestors. Not because their sin and disgraceful ways are anything to be proud of, but because Jesus came to seek and to save those who are lost, including his own ancestors. Jesus came not for the righteous, but to call sinners to repentance. He was not ashamed to call Judah and Perez and Rahab and Ruth his ancestors, and he is not ashamed to call you his brother, because Jesus is the friend of sinners, the Lion, the Redeemer who came from the clan of Perez. All right. I want to conclude by coming back to the idea of Ruth's gifts. There are so many ways I wish I could conclude this book, but this is one. Ruth was more than anything else in this story. Well, she is, first of all, someone turning from their idols to come seek the true God of Israel. And then she is someone who sacrificially and faithfully loves others. She was a giver. It's a love story about Ruth's love for Naomi. So I want to just close with 3 reminders about Ruth's, all of her gifts, her generosity. 3 things that you see on your handout. First of all, God usually gives his gifts through his people. God usually gives his gifts through his people. So when the book of Ruth begins, it looks all dark and terrible. But did God have plans to do a lot of giving? Yes. How is he going to do that giving? Through Boaz, through Ruth. God is generous through us. When I was a teenager, I had the opportunity to take a little preaching class. And I praise the Lord for that. Teaching teenage boys to preach is a wonderful thing. But it's also very challenging to keep a teenage boy learning how to preach from becoming arrogant. And so we had a theme song for that class, a song that our teacher wanted to just pound into us. And it was the old hymn, Channels Only. And I'll just read you 3 phrases from it. Thou hast saved and cleansed and filled me, that I might thy channel be. Just a channel full of blessing to the thirsty hearts around, with no power, but as thou givest graciously with each command. And that teacher was trying to impress on us that no matter how highly we might have thought of our own brilliance or eloquence or whatever, we were always nothing more than channels for God to use if God wanted to use us. So the hymn is called Channels Only. And he wanted us to never forget we were only channels. God usually gives his gift through channels, through his people. Secondly, God gives to others through our sacrificial love even when we can't see it. It is not as if when the book of Ruth begins, God comes to Ruth and Boaz and says, okay, you two, now listen, here's the scoop. I'm going to ask you guys to do a lot of kind of crazy sacrificial things, but it's going to turn out awesome. You're going to get so much great stuff out of the deal. It's totally going to be worth it. Okay? So just trust me here. And when it looks like it's hard, don't worry. It's going to be great. That never happened. Other than that, they trusted God himself, you know. We don't get to see the results of sacrificial love at the time when we're expected to pour out our lives in sacrificial love. That's the point. You see what I'm saying? We might never get to see what God does through our sacrificial love. Sometimes it will look to you like you poured yourself out in sacrificial love for someone and came up completely empty. You will be certain that it didn't matter. And first of all, that is never true. Because no matter what they do with it, if you honored God by your sacrificial love, it matters forever. But secondly, don't measure what God does with it by what you can see. You, with your little tiny human perspective, can only see a little teeny tiny bit of what God's doing. Don't make such big conclusions. You don't know what God did that you never even knew about. So don't be motivated for sacrificial love by the results. Be motivated by the confidence that God will work the results that he wants, whether you ever see it or not. He's our Savior, it's our redemption, and so we love God and others, not looking for how it's going to turn out, but trusting that God will use it. And so then thirdly, and this is my favorite point, God can give through us far more than we have to give. When we name people like Tamar and Rahab and Ruth, we are naming ladies who were nothings in the eyes of society. These were people who seemingly had nothing to give. Think about Ruth in particular. How could she possibly build up the house of Israel? She's just trying to get a day's food. That's like going and finding a woman on the streets on Skid Row in LA and saying to her, hey, would you please build the $3 billion stadium for the Rams and Chargers just down the road? She's just trying to get that day's food. There is no $3 billion she's going to come up with. What did Ruth have to give? When the story starts, what did Ruth have to give? She's walking back to Bethlehem with a mother-in-law who has nothing. And she has nothing. God can give through us far more than we have to give. What did Ruth have to give? She had the potential to give loyal, sacrificial love. She worked hard and she set aside her own interests and she poured herself out in love, loyal love. That was all she had to give. And isn't that the greatest thing you can give anyways? Right? How many of you in this room are able to give sacrificial love to other people? Here, let's do it. How many of you in this room are able to give sacrificial love to other people? Come on, let's do it. Let's do it. See, we live in such a materialistic society that when we think about birthdays, what do we think about? Spending money on stuff. When we think about Christmas, what do we think about? When we think about how to thank somebody, what do we think about? Now, I'm not saying that you cannot take money and give it in wonderful ways. It can be a tremendous way to give. But you don't need any money to be a tremendous giver. As a matter of fact, if money leads you to just give money and not have to give yourself, then it's gotten you off track. Everybody can give loyal, sacrificial love if God changes their heart to be like Jesus. And so, because Ruth was just a channel for God, there were no limits on what she could give. A moment ago, I referred to channels only, and I referred to it as a humbling song that reminds us that we're just a channel. But it's also a very encouraging song, because if I'm just a channel, then I'm not limited by my own resources. I'm just a channel for somebody else's resources that flow through me. And that somebody else is the God who owns all things. So that what comes to mind right away when I think about that is Matthew 14 and 15, as Pastor John mentioned this morning, or John chapter 6, where Jesus takes the loaves and the fishes and he multiplies them and feeds thousands. He's on this rural mountain and large crowds came to him, and he said to one of the disciples, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" And John adds this, he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus knew where the provision was going to come from already. He had it taken care of. But Philip needed to understand what it meant to be a channel who has almost nothing, but a God who has everything. Right? And so Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread, 200 days' wages, would not be enough for each of them to get a little bit. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" I love that Andrew said that, because you hear his doubting, what are they for so many? But he still had the guts to say, with thousands of people to feed, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. I mean, that itself took guts, right? Even though he couldn't figure out how this could work. So Andrew has the courage to say, there's a boy here who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, also the fish, as much as they wanted. And then they end up with these 12 baskets of fragments. There's another account of that, Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus says to the disciples, you give them something to eat. Put them right on the spot. Do they believe that through them, God had the necessary resources? You see how that makes it clear it's a channel. You give them something to eat. And yet you're going to have God give more than you can give, because there's no way you can do it. God took Ruth, a poor Moabite widow, and gave incredible gifts to Naomi, Boaz, Bethlehem, the nation of Israel, the world, and even us, through a woman who was a nothing in the eyes of society. So, don't be swayed by the impossibility of the need. More than ever before, your silly phone shows you the needs of the whole world. And you can be like, why does it matter? You got natural disasters everywhere. You got hurting people everywhere. What can we do? That is God's business. Our job is to do what we can where we're at. So don't be swayed by the impossibility of the need. Secondly, don't be bothered by how little you have to give. Never forget that your bank account does not limit how much you can give, because you can give sacrificial, loyal, faithful love. So the question is whether we love Jesus because of his sacrificial life that poured out himself to be our Redeemer, and whether we believe Jesus that it is more blessed to give than to receive. God can give through you far more than you have to give if you believe Jesus, that the way to save your life is not to hoard it for yourself, but to pour it out for others. Do you see how that connects to Ruth? Ruth had several key moments when she could have said, I love you, Naomi, but bye. I got to go take care of myself. And you really couldn't have blamed her for it. And so Jesus says, so do you believe me? That the way to save your life is to lose it for my sake? To lay your life down in faithful and sacrificial love? So I hope that as we leave the book of Ruth, there are many things I hope you'll remember. But I hope you remember that it's a love story of Ruth's sacrificial and faithful love for Naomi. And that might help us remember Jesus' sacrificial and faithful love for us. And that might then lead to a life of sacrificial and faithful love for others through us. Just a channel. But God can give so much more than you have if you'll lay down your life out of love for Jesus, your Redeemer.